walking alone, the streets are empty. The only thing I can see is my own silhouette. I'm getting stronger, step by step. The clock is ticking, but there's no time for regrets.
In this entry, I will discuss the history of combat and military gear as a broad overview, but with an emphasis on patterns that I have observed. In order to predict the future, and for those predictions to be worth anything at all, we must first understand the past and learn to recognize patterns. But before I get into the history, I must first engage in some preamble. An issue that often comes up is the use of lethal force by law enforcement. There is actually a reason why law enforcement shoots to kill rather than wound. The torso of the body is the largest target, and therefore the easiest to hit. Incidentally, it is also where the bulk of essential organs are, so it presents the most logical target for attack. In other words, it is the portion of the body which you have both the highest probability to hit and the highest probability to damage a vital organ. A headshot will cause instant death, naturally, but the head is a smaller target and therefore more difficult to hit. Arms and legs are smaller targets, and hitting them is not fatal, though it can cause permanent and debilitating injury. During combat situations, time is limited, so you must focus your attention on the parts of your enemy which you are most likely to hit, and which will yield the most devastating results in the quickest fashion. This is also why police will wear armor and chest today, and why, as we go through history, the head and chest will be the first areas of the body to receive protection and the last areas to lose it. That being said, let us now look back in history. During the Bronze Age, there was very little worn in the way of armor. Sometimes combatants may have nothing more than a shield and a weapon, which was often either a sword or a spear. The shield would protect the core of the body at long and close range. Ancient Egyptian foot soldiers would wear hardened fabric for armor, which would protect them from glancing blows, I suppose, but not something which is well swung and unmitigated. When it comes to metal armor, the use of helmets and chest plates were the most common. As mentioned earlier, the top priority was to protect the torso and the head, which are the most vulnerable parts of the body as well as the most likely to be targeted. After the Bronze Age collapse, the Neo-Assyrian Empire emerges, and they create the world's first professional army. Iron is easier to work than bronze, and it allows for mass production of weapons and armor. There are better weapons, and it also becomes feasible for more troops, and more of their bodies, to be protected. The typical protective gear is a helmet, shield, and chest piece, which is often more flexible than what was worn in the Bronze Age. The Assyrians begin to use scale and lamellar armor, and the oldest fragments of this type of armor which have been found were produced by the Assyrians. They are followed by the Chinese, who begin to use lamellar armor in the 400s BC. The Babylonians, Achaemenid Persians, Greeks, and early Romans will continue to follow this basic pattern. Some cultures will also make use of shin guards, and there will be some use of plate armor, but there will not yet be anything that encloses the entire body. Greater use was made of cavalry, and eventually chariots would fall out of use. Phalanxes were created in response to cavalry. Coming to the Romans, the most iconic period for weapons and armor is probably the 1st century AD. The gear worn by the Roman soldiers of the 1st century is the type of armor which often appears in movies, and that may be due to this being the century of Christ, in which the final chapters of the Bible were written. The gear consists of plate armor covering the chest, a rectangular shield, a helmet, and sometimes shin guards. When most people think of the Roman Empire, they probably think of something like this, or at least that has been what I've observed. However, this would change as time went on, so any movies or illustrations showing the fall of Rome which depict this style of armor, rectangular shields, or even people wearing togas, are incorrect. The Romans also made use of mail armor, but they had nothing which covered the entire body. Late Roman armor of the Western Empire was quite different, and during the Byzantine period there would be a multitude of changes. The Germanic barbarians who sacked Rome followed the same basic pattern of the ancient world, having, at most, armor on their heads and chests, as well as shields. Other barbarous groups, such as Huns and Scythians, would also follow this pattern. As time goes on, improvements will be made to the armor in an effort to cover as much of the body as possible. Examples of this are shown on the Bayeux Tapestry, which depicts the Norman conquest of England in the 11th century. Helmets and shields are still being used. Eventually, the male armor will cover most of the body, except for the face. But for that, helmets with face plates will be used. For an example of this, you can think of the Crusaders. Going forward in time, plates are added to the armor, beginning with chest plates. By the 1420s, the entire body is covered in metal plates. This leads to the development of newer and more destructive weapons, such as maces, hammers, larger swords, and crossbows. Crossbows are able to pierce the armor even from a distance, but the use of full body armor continued up until the introduction of guns. With the introduction of guns in the early Renaissance period, the full body armor became more of a liability than an asset. The armor could not stop a bullet, but the early pistols and rifles had to be reloaded after every shot, so melee combat would remain a significant factor. Soldiers would still carry swords, but armor was taken off, beginning, it would seem, with the legs and then the arms. For examples of this, you can think of the conquistadors. Towards the end of the 17th century, they would only wear helmets and breastplates, and these were primarily to protect them during melee combat, as they were not able to stop the bullets. During the 1700s, armor is completely done away with, as more efficient guns are created which can be fired and reloaded at a greater rate. It's considered to be an encumbrance and not worth the effort either for production or to wear. Unfortunately, there's no attempt made at camouflage either, and no attempt of any sort that I've seen to protect the soldiers. Uniforms serve mainly to indicate rank and allegiance. In one way, the uniforms can serve as protection, because if they are identified with a powerful enough empire, then less powerful cultures may hesitate to start a fight with soldiers who wear the uniforms of the stronger culture. On the other hand, they also serve to paint targets on the men because they let everyone know who exactly they are shooting at as well as who not to shoot at. Now, at this point, you might be thinking that I am concentrating rather heavily on Europe. But this is due mainly to the fact that the rest of the world did not develop fully encompassing plate armor before the advent of guns, or at least the integration of guns into their culture. This is mainly due to the fact that different parts of the world and different cultures develop at different speeds during different time periods. That has always been the case, and I suspect that it always will be, though which areas and cultures are moving the fastest is always prone to change. It looks to me that Chinese heavy armor reached its maximum during the Ming Dynasty, but guns were introduced before the Ming Dynasty reached a point where they felt the need for a full suit of plate armor, and as a result, further developments of armor were put to a halt. During the Qing Dynasty, the armor was phased out as guns became more prevalent. In Japan, the samurai were almost completely covered in armor, but had not yet reached the point where they had a full suit of plate armor before guns were introduced. In India, the climate is such that wearing a full suit of heavy, European-style plate armor might have been fatal, but at any rate, guns were brought in from the outside before they got to that point. By the time we get to the 1800s, all the great powers are using guns, and they have almost entirely removed the last vestiges of armor. During the 1800s there is, for the most part, no protection at all, though some cultures still may utilize helmets to some degree. The main purpose of uniforms is to indicate rank and allegiance. There is no effort, that I have seen, made to protect the soldiers, either through armor or camouflage. Guns are advancing rapidly, and it is during this time that revolvers and the Gatling gun are invented. There is no real defense against these weapons. During the 1900s, armor begins to return, and there are attempts made at camouflage. During World War I, the armies begin to wear helmets, but the primary purpose of the helmets is to protect from shrapnel rather than bullets. Uniforms are brown in an attempt to blend in with the landscape, and later on the splotchy camouflage will appear. In the later half of the 20th century, bulletproof helmets and vests will come into use. At this point, it's not practical to cover the entire body. But just like in the early days of the Assyrians and Romans, they will prioritize covering the parts of the soldier where a hit would most likely result in death. In the 21st century, more gear has been added to protect the soldiers in response to better weapons. There are now knee pads and elbow pads with plans and efforts to cover more of the body in development. We are in a place now which is reminiscent to the early Middle Ages in terms of which parts of the body and how much are being covered with protective armor. What comes next? There are a few possibilities I have seen for what comes next. If bullets remain the primary method for killing men, then they will most likely cover the entire body in some kind of armor. Talos was a recent attempt by the US Army to create a system of body armor that also included a mechanical exoskeleton. The exoskeleton would increase the strength of the soldier and allow him to carry more weight while putting less stress on the body. The Talos suit would also include systems to feed the soldier live tactical information through a heads-up display, regulate temperature, and monitor life signs. Talos was canceled in 2019 due to difficulties in getting all the systems to coordinate, but the work of devising new systems of protection and weapons continues. New advancements in armor are allowing more of the soldier's body to be protected with thinner and lighter materials, and exoskeletons are still in development. So it is entirely likely that something similar to the Iron Man armor will appear, but in a more utilitarian fashion, I'm sure. On the other hand, if bullets cease to be the primary method of killing, then a new response will be required. As of 2020, combat lasers have been created and tested which can destroy moving vehicles. The US military is working on ways to improve the efficacy, range, and energy requirements of the lasers. The goal is to put them on vehicles and in the hands of soldiers. Right now, they cannot make them small enough to effectively arm all the soldiers with them, but that is one of the goals. If the US is working on this, then other countries certainly will be as well. After all, they have very little choice in the matter. When guns were new, cannons were utilized before individual arms, and even after they were made small enough for men to carry and use individually, it still took a few centuries before swords were completely phased out. I assume that the laser which destroyed the drone could easily pierce through any type of armor the soldiers in any modern army are wearing. It would probably be a very minor impediment to the laser, if it was any at all. If this continues, proliferates, and especially if it is miniaturized to a level that every soldier can have a laser gun, then there will need to be some answer for it. Now, this is my speculation about the future. I am not a scientist, and I deliberately avoided physics back in college, but I would think that the most efficient way to counter energy would be with another type of energy. I know for sure the current body armor will not suffice, so there may be a period of reduced armor while a new defense is devised. Maybe there would be a layer of protective clothing combined with some sort of dampening field generated by a portable device. Of course, this is just my meager attempt at guessing. There may be a solid material devised which can block the laser, in which case the laser would either be upgraded or replaced with something more powerful in response. On the other hand, it is possible that the world will suffer a dark age in which technology is reduced to a more primitive level. A nuclear war could do this most efficiently, but an internal breakdown of the Earth's most advanced powers might also do it. Biological warfare could lead to a dark age, and there's also the possibility of EMP strikes. We could take a great leap backwards. The only way for humans to really predict the future in any sort of meaningful way is to look into the past and see what has happened over the greater span of history. An individual lifespan, even if you live to be 100 years old, is not enough to understand how the world works. There are patterns to history and to human behavior at the aggregate level. These patterns can be recognized and anticipated, but even so, it is impossible to know what will happen for sure. You can only make an educated guess. You can make predictions which are reasonable, and which may even come true. I have in some cases. But the further you go out into the future, the less you can predict. So, to summarize the topic, there is a period of weapon, defense, and weapon until eventually a weapon is created for which there is no known defense. The 1700s and 1800s can be viewed as a coping period in this respect. I imagine there might be another coping period as laser weapons come into play, but the same basic pattern will continue even if there is a dark age that sets things back.